great to see this fantastic turnout, and I'll just cover very briefly a little bit about the legislation, not going into too much detail because we want to get on to how to respond rather than into the nitty-gritty, but I think it's important to just think a little bit about that and then some of the challenges that come with that. This slide has a little bit of an overview of the legislation, and as Robin said, there's both a New South Wales one and a Commonwealth one. The New South Wales one currently not operational and in our level of review. So let me just focus on the Commonwealth one. I prefer to call it a modern slavery reporting requirement rather than the Modern Slavery Act, because it really literally is just a reporting requirement that is being acted in that. Primarily, and most of you probably have heard of it, but just to summarize, entities with, primarily companies with more than $100 million of global consolidated revenue with some form of operations in Australia are required to report. And it's an annual reporting requirement that has to be approved by the board. It has to be reported within 6 months of the end of the corporate reporting year. So for reporters that use the Australian financial years, it's by 31st of December of that particular year that they have to report this. They have to submit it to the relevant Home Affairs Minister, that then publishes it on a public repository. And there are very few specific reporting requirements, but there are some, which is a difference to the UK Act, which doesn't actually have any direct requirements as to what needs to be reported, but there are some specific things that needs to be reported, and we've got some of them up there. Things like reporting on the business structure, reporting on actual modern slavery risks, which would require some level of understanding of risks. What actions are taken to address risks, which you would suspect requires some level of actions being taken, and also assessment of the effectiveness of those actions, and all of this speaks to some level of due diligence. There are currently no penalties for not reporting, but there are some ways whereby the minister can ask, or shouldn't you report, and thereby potentially embarrassing an organisation that fails to report. I think one of the interesting things as well is that the Australian government is required to report, and I think for them to do a proper report, they would basically have to put this into their own procurement requirements. So for all public procurement, I would expect sometime in future for all Commonwealth public procurement that the government starts to require those that they procure from to document how they are preventing or mitigating risks of modern slavery. But of course we can't say for sure, we can just say that they are required to report. The New South Wales Act is, I would say, a more fully fledged Modern Slavery Act, because whilst it has a reporting requirement, it has a whole raft of other things in it, such as an anti-slavery commissioner that should work with government agencies and to try and make better prevention of modern slavery in New South Wales, as well as educational activities, and a whole raft of other aspects. The reporting requirement as it's drafted, and what we've got up there is what was in legislation before it came under review, so some of this might change, but it had a $50 million threshold for reporting, but then no specific requirements for reporting. But the idea and intention was that if a company complies with the Commonwealth Act, then that's fine, should be fine under this. One of the things I think is of most interest in the New South Wales Act is a direct requirement to change the public procurement code for New South Wales, so that New South Wales public procurement takes reasonable steps to ensure goods and services are not the product of modern slavery. That's more than $30 billion of annual public procurement in New South Wales that would be required to take action. Now, to me, that sounds much more promising in terms of doing action against modern slavery than requiring companies to report, to be very honest. But yeah, the Act is under review, so we'll wait and see what happens. Very briefly, there are different ways of responding. One could ignore the obligation. I'm not going to talk too much to that. Then you can have a reactive response. That's a minimum. That's a conscious decision to do minimum effort to comply. From a legal perspective, I am sure that's perfectly legitimate. However, I would say, as Robin was just going through, don't disregard the risk of modern slavery occurring in your supply chains or something that your business is involved with. And also consider the reporting requirements. Again, compliance requires annual reporting of modern slavery risks, annual reporting of what due diligence actions has been done to assess and address those risks, and some assessment of effectiveness of it, and annual approval by the board. So even minimum compliance sort of cajoles companies into doing more. And so that's where a more proactive response, it tries to kind of cajole companies into a more proactive response, but that's a lot harder. Where you're really truly trying to address the risk of modern slavery and not just complying. That's what we recommend companies do, and also consider broader risks than merely just modern slavery risks. But I think one of the key things here is to realize that we're at the start of a journey. So most companies have not thought about this until recently. And we don't know what the risks are. We don't know how we're engaging with those risks. We don't know how to prevent them. We don't know how to we just simply don't know how to address them yet. So a lot of companies having these types of questions. I think one should start and compare it a bit with the safety management journey or safety culture journey. Like 30 years ago, a lot of companies would have said, "Oh, look, accidents happen," but that's not what happens today. Most companies say, "Well, we have zero tolerance," and it's not just that they have zero tolerance; they also have processes to have a credible path to at least have very few incidents. And really trying hard to achieve zero tolerance. And I think it's the same type of attitude we should have to this. We're not going to get this perfect immediately. This is going to take a number of years, whether that's 5 or 10 or 15 years, I'm not sure. Of course, we want to do it as quickly as possible, but we have to realize that. Now, this slide, I'm not going to go into too much detail in this slide. What I want to show is that, and some of the case studies later will touch on aspects of this. This is a summary of the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and what it requires. And the modern slavery reporting requirement is modeled around this. So it says that the board has to approve the statement every year, which basically makes it a governance approach. So you have a policy commitment that's governance. You have to have some form of impact or risk assessment. You have to have prevention and mitigation activities, and you have to account for and report. And you have to, so those are things that you have to do under the modern slavery statement anyway. And then it says, well, you should do it with business integration, you should consult with stakeholders, and you should have a grievance mechanism. And it also tells you, well, what should you consider if you find modern slavery? So it gives some guidance on that. High-level guidance, they're guiding principles, they're not detailed implementation requirements. But this helps companies to think through these issues. Key benefits, it aligns with the reporting requirement. It gives a framework for how to and how much at times. So sometimes like how much should we do? And there are some guiding principles on what that means. It can improve risk management. So basically improving blind spots that you're not aware of. It's endorsed by the Australian government and it aligns with internationally recognized guidance. So our advice to all our clients is think about this when you do this. So last slide is to basically say that to do this well, you need to set up a governance framework. Just like for safety, you have a governance framework and then you have a management framework underneath that. It is anchored at the highest level of governance. And so I think what the smart thing about the reporting requirement is that this is questions that basically the board has to answer every year when they approve their modern slavery statement. What is your company doing to prevent and mitigate modern slavery? That has to be in the reporting. Are you as directors and executives okay with what is being done? You have to sit there and look at, we approve this reporting, is it good enough? And then I suppose another one is to say, well, what trading or business implications might this have? In particular, if there are push from supply chain through supply chains that our customers are actually requesting this to be done. But there could be other pressures such as investor pressure and employee pressure and other commercial pressures. Then there are a number of questions that those that have to implement this might want to consider, and I think those are some of the questions that will come up today. Some of these you might get some answers to this today. You probably won't get the full answers to this, but I think, and I'm hopeful that there will be some answers to this. So firstly, well, what are our risks? Do we cause or contribute to these risks, or are we just linked to them? Big difference whether we have actually done something that actually exacerbated the risk. How do we find out? How do we work out how to do this, and who should find out? Which functions should be involved? What policies and procedures needs to be updated? How do we engage the board and the senior executives? And not least, what do we do if we find modern slavery? And I would say one thing here is terminating contracts might not be the right response at all. That might be the worst response. That might take you from having been linked to an incident to suddenly causing or contributing worse things to happen. So in child labor, it's been widely acknowledged for a while for a lot of companies that work with this, that if you find child labor in the supply chain and you terminate the contract, you might actually end up with children from having poor work to getting into sex work. And these are the types of things, the first thing you have to have in mind, which Robin was saying, this is about people. If you find incidents of modern slavery, there's someone that is being harmed. There's people out there that are being harmed. That should be your primary concern. And it might not be terminating contracts. That's the first and best thing to do.